And it's kind of astonishing because like I said, I mean, no one even really knows who I am, but they do. The Muslims that hear me are pretty agitated, so I have received, a couple death threats. But we probably do see eye to eye, just in the respect of thinking that Islam is not true. Probably. Is that what you meant, or did
Yeah,
you mean something else?
yeah. I mean, that's the main thing. I think there's other aspects of discussion about Islam as well, right? So within unbelieving progressive circles, there's going to be one camp that's like, well, they're the religion of peace, and don't pick on them. That's saying anything about how Islam is not true is disrespectful and that sort of thing. But it seems like you're definitely more in the going to criticize all religions fairly sort of camp.
Yeah, I think so. I think each religion is unique in their own ways. But yeah, I think largely religions that I'm familiar with are not completely accurate. There's some issues. But I remember getting the sense that you were Christian. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
I'm a Christian. Not any particular denomination. I'm going to a Messianic church, but there's I'm pretty. I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as a Lutheran or Catholic or anything like that.
Gotcha. Kind of, would you maybe describe yourself as a non-denominational Christian that emphasizes the relationship with Jesus? That's kind of where you're at.
I think that's fair. I do think that some of the people who emphasize the relationship with Jesus go a little bit too far in that direction, as far as God's my buddy, like someone you would talk to on Facebook or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's fair to characterize me that way.
Yeah, we were speaking on Facebook, right? That's how we got in touch with each other,
Yeah, that's right.
and specifically about Messiah. And I could tell that we had different conceptions of what Messiah meant, and so that's what intrigued me. I wanted to talk to you about that. I kind of. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that some there was some sharp disagreement on some issues, and yeah, you reached out to me. That was very nice.
Yeah, yeah. It seems to me that there's a pretty prominent theme within Christendom that the Messiah is spoken of in a pretty static, uniform way in the Hebrew Bible, leading up to the coming of the Messiah at a future point in time to redeem all people, and that Messiah will be God. Would you say that that's along the same lines as your conception of Messiah?
Um, so I don't think it is the case that there's one monolithic view of what the Messiah is, going back from the beginning and going all the way forward to it being the Messiah. Um, I think actually you and I may agree on a lot of that part of the discussion. Um, but I do think that there is such a thing as the Messiah. It makes sense to talk about the Messiah given the verses.
Okay. So, how do you distinguish between a Messiah and the Messiah?
Yeah. So one of the points of agreement that I think we have from my understanding of our discussions, and I did watch your video on what is the meaning of Messiah as well.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah.
So I think we agree that the Messiah means anointed one. And this has to do with sort of a process that goes way back to the beginning in Genesis, where they would anoint them with oil. It literally means smear, Mashiach. It means smear. So it would be like smearing the oil over something. And my understanding is that the idea of that is that this object or person is now appointed to a certain position, or they have a purpose now. They've been assigned a purpose. And So it's not that there is only one Mashiach. There are many Mashiachs throughout Old Testament history, or the history in the Hebrew Bible. But there is still one which we tend to call the Mashiach, who's this bigger than life character who's talked about many times in very many passages. So that's kind of the thing. It's like, yes, there is the Messiah, but it also has a lot of other applications.
You said that Mashiach means smear, and my understanding of Mashiach was that it meant the anointed one or anointed one, meaning, and I guess anointed could mean smear, I guess, like to smear oil.
Yeah, I think that as a very, like, the most concrete, the most original way that the word was used as a verb, it was about smearing, but then it gets turned into a noun. Okay, this is the anointed one. And as you know very well, kings were anointed ones. So King Saul would have been smeared with the oil, and then he would have been the Lord's anointed. There's a lot of talk about him being the Lord's anointed with the purpose of being the king.
For sure. And that in my view, I understand where the Christians emphasize that some of this text points to a future coming of a Messiah who will be significant, but it seems like that's pretty much up to interpretation. In my interpretation, it seems like throughout the Hebrew Bible, these different messiahs that are definitively identified as Messiah are also accompanied by future messianic implications as well. And these don't necessarily point to the coming of a God or the coming of a Savior to redeem anyone from sin necessarily, but rather more in a traditional sense to redeem people in their contemporary time or shortly to come, to at times reestablish a kingdom, and so I think I view it more as a more, I guess, tangible way for those people who are writing.
So let me say a couple things. So as far as the issue of interpretation, I very much agree that there are many passages which are open to interpretation. And this is where a lot of the disagreement within Christendom comes from. However, I think that it would be beyond interpretation to say that there's no reference to the Messiah or anything like that. So, for example, there are a couple of passages which spring to mind, and you mentioned these in your video as well. Passages like in Isaiah 11, where it talks about there will be this king who comes. Isaiah 16, Jeremiah 23, and well, let's leave it at those three for now. I think that it's very clear that there is this kingly figure who's the branch, who's the root of Jesse. So if we in any case, I think that part is beyond interpretation.
If you look at the it seems like the text that was written in the Second Temple period lacks mention of Messiah in any prominent way. You see that, the temple existed. There was really not a need for a Messiah as there were in other periods. And I think that's why we see that lack of text prominently mentioning Messiah. Anyone at that time that wrote about Messiah was, I think, they were in a minority. I don't really see the prominent theme of Messiah in Second Temple literature, and if it is mentioned, it's widely variant. And so we definitely disagree, I think, on that point, that people were really concerned, really centered on this idea of a coming Messiah that would redeem everyone in the future, especially in the Second Temple period, at least.
Yeah, well, that's sort of an interesting thing, because on the one hand, I did see where you said that in the video, and quoted quite a few scholars to that effect, that during the Second Temple period, there weren't a lot of people talking about Messiah. I think there are a couple of things going on here. First of which is that the terminology, the Messiah, wasn't necessarily something that was uniformly used as it is today. I think we see that beginning to happen in the first century, especially as we look at the Gospels. But even within the Gospels, there are times where people they're not quite sure what word to use. Are we talking about the Messiah, or we have John the Baptist saying, "Are you the one who is to come?" So I think it wasn't quite solidified to the point that it is now. But on the other hand, while you quote these sources who say, well, there wasn't really that much interest in Messiah, or there wasn't a unified view of what Messiah is. On the other hand, you have the fact that there was a Messiah fever. There were a lot of people in the first century, certainly, who were claiming to be Messiah. In my opinion, this is because they interpreted Daniel 9. They looked at how many years it was before the Messiah was to come, and then they say, oh yeah, well, this is about the time the Messiah is to appear. So you have a whole slew of people. You mentioned a lot of these people in your videos. You've gone into a lot of detail on them, talking about Simon and Judas. You mentioned another one, and I could add to that Thaddeus. There's the Simon, the son of forgetting his name, but there were a lot of people. And so I'm not sure how to fit all that together, but I am inclined to agree with your idea that, yeah, probably right before the time of Jesus, there may not have been much written about it, specifically using those words, the Messiah.
And speaking on the messiahs, the popularly anointed messiahs, I think those people definitely there were messianic implications there, and I think specifically for the intent of restoring that Judaic kingdom. These people didn't view themselves as gods or redeemers of sin. I think they were strictly acting in the traditional sense of Messiah, which is to restore the people, restore the Jews, restore their governance. And so this, I don't think that those, the fact that there were messiahs points to any future coming of a Messiah. Those prophetic passages that we find in the Hebrew Bible, I think we have to interpret in a certain way, specifically with a Christian lens to get that interpretation.
Yeah. So I'd like to just say here in response to you, we were talking about the false messiahs, and actually this is something
they weren't
that
false messiahs. They were messiahs.
Well, from our perspective, they're false messiahs.
Yeah.
And just to say that this is what Jesus talked about specifically in Matthew 24, verse 23 to 25. He says, "At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time."
Yeah. I think, the Gospels were written by people who had already understood that Jesus had died. The people had been trying to make sense of why Jesus died. And this is obviously contradictory to your view, but in that attempt to understand why Jesus died, they concluded that there was this Messiah that was to come, and Jesus was that Messiah, but in a different way. Not the Messiah of a king, but a Messiah in a specific way that fit the historical occurrences that happened in 30 CE with his death.
And just to be clear, if I quote a verse like that or something, I'm not necessarily quoting it to disagree with you or try to persuade you to my way of seeing things. Obviously, you and I come from very different worldviews. We're looking at these things in very different ways. And some of what I'm doing here is just representing things the way I see it.
Mm-hmm, for sure. We did share some ideas in my past. I was Mormon. I don't know if you saw that on my channel. I talk about it a little bit, but you might not even classify me as a prior Christian even, but I was a Christian, and I did share some of these same ideas with you for most of my life, actually. So let's say, if I were to ask you to point to the text or the verse in the Hebrew Bible that does the best job of pointing to this coming Messiah and to act in the form of Jesus, which would be the most powerful or clear verse to do that in your opinion?
Very good. So actually, you bring up something that I did want to mention about what you said earlier. So you meant, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but paraphrasing what you said, part of the idea was that, yes, you acknowledge that there are a lot of these verses, but these people who are calling themselves Messiah in the first century, they're thinking of themselves as an earthly Messiah, an earthly ruler who's going to throw off the shackles of Rome, and not someone who's going to die for their sins. Yep. And I completely agree with that. And I think that is to say, I completely agree that that's what those people thought, most of them. And there are a lot of messianic verses which are like that. And of course, as a believer, I believe that Jesus either has done, is in the process, or is going to do many of those things that are in those verses. However, you are also correct to say that a big part of what we focus on as far as Jesus' messianic work is his dying for our sins, our redemption, and things along that line. And so I can give you a couple passages right now that will speak more to that part of it. There are other very strong messianic verses which, have to do with the judgment, coming in fire, this sort of thing, but which I think may be equally strong or stronger about there being the Messiah. But a couple that I can just mention real quickly as far as that lead us to believe that he will suffer and die. Okay, so the strongest by far is going to be Isaiah 52 and 53. That begins in verse 13 of Isaiah 52, and then the entire chapter of the chapter of 53. If you want to look at like a verse or two, I could try to pull up a verse or two that gets to that point. But this is the one that I would say is the strongest. There are a couple of others which read very much like it. So these verses talk about like the crucified Messiah. Okay. So Isaiah 53 has that idea of the crucified Messiah. You also have Psalm 22, sounds very much like that. And Isaiah 50, verses 4 to 11. So these are the ones that I think most directly talk about Jesus on the cross. And of course, we know that Psalm 22 begins with the phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And this is also the phrase which Jesus himself says while he's on the cross dying. And I think the best way to understand that is that Jesus is referring people to look at that psalm as something which is being fulfilled.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't mention the cross in Isaiah 52 or 53.
I believe you're correct about that. However, it does. There are references, and I don't remember exactly which one is which.
Mm-hmm.
There's the piercing of the hands and feet, which I believe is Isaiah 53. There's also the vinegar is present in one of them, and surrounded. There's also a reference to gambling for his clothes. And I'm sure there are many more, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but there are these things which lead us, it certainly sounds like the crucifixion process.
It doesn't mention piercing the hands or feet either. It says pierced. It says he was pierced.
Okay.
It says he was pierced for our transgressions. But I understand what you're saying with these, and I don't want to get too far off topic. But do you see it as possible that the gospel writers had this text and was able to, as they were processing what happened to the man Jesus and interpreting their Jewish text, that they may have implemented some of this ancient text into their own writing?
So I don't take conspiratorial theories very seriously. Now, it's fine for you to. I don't have a problem.
Are you saying it's a conspiracy that the writers of the Gospels had the Hebrew Bible?
No, it's not. So and to be clear here, they absolutely did have access to all these texts. And we, as a believer, I believe that it says in the Gospels that Jesus also came back after his resurrection and explained many of these things to them. So I in no way dispute that they had access to these texts and that they may have interpreted them in a certain way. I think the ones about his crucifixion, they may not have realized until after, probably when he said on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? These things would have come to the minds of very many people. So I don't dispute that at all. But, if you're asking me to say, oh, well, is it possible that or do you think it's likely that they, went in a dark room and, looked up all the passages and made up a story about him being crucified? That I don't believe.
Well, it's possible though, right?
Yeah, I think that from your perspective, this is something which should be considered as an option. Absolutely. I don't have a problem with you thinking that that's the best explanation. I don't have a problem with considering, atheistic explanations, but I'm just saying that for me, like as already a believer, like there are so many other reasons to be a believer that to really go down that road, I would have to discount all these other things first. So personally, I don't take it very seriously.
That's understandable. So in Isaiah 52 and 53, we do read about a suffering servant. What messianic language would you identify here exactly? Because you are identifying descriptions which Jesus endured, but I could definitely see that easily as a projection of one historical event onto another one that is in a completely different context. So what like strictly messianic language do we have here other than what happened to Jesus?
Yeah, well, I may or may not have fully understood but I'll try to give an answer here. So the reason that I quoted this is because we were asking what's this idea of the suffering servant, the one who dies for our sins.
Well, I was just saying Messiah. Like, what's the best Hebrew text in your view that talks about a coming Messiah in the future to redeem people of sins?
Okay.
And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So now you're asking specifically which ones have a phrase like the Messiah in it.
Well, just messianic language. Yeah. I do see the language here
of
like events that occurred with Jesus, but that's projecting what happened to Jesus onto Hebrew texts, which is kind of backwards, starting from the foundation.
Well, we think they were put there to describe the Messiah, but I will say this in agreement to extend the olive branch. People reading this before the time of Messiah may not have understood that this was about Messiah. They might have said, okay, this is a different person This is the suffering servant. This could be something totally different. And then there's the Messiah passages over here. So yeah, let's talk about Messiah passages. I accept your question. So I think specifically, this may not be the strongest messianic one, but the one that you will agree from having seen your videos most clearly talks about Messiah in the context of this special anointed one is Daniel 9:25. So, and you mentioned this in your video. This is, I think, the most clear one where it uses the word Messiah, talking about an individual person.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very clear from the context that this is a person of significance. And there are other messiahs too, but of course we see this as being about Jesus as well, the Messiah. There is disagreement. Unfortunately here we've walked into the most difficult to interpret passage in the Bible. Daniel 9 is the most difficult chapter, I think. However, as it turns out, that's the one which most clearly says Messiah in this way.
Read it. Let's read it for the viewers.
Yeah,
just
great.
For the 20 people that might watch this. Unless, I don't know if you're going to put it somewhere. But so yeah, Daniel chapter 9 verses 25 or 24 and 20, 25 and 26 read, "Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one," which in the Hebrew, I'm sure that must have read Mashiach. I think that's the explicit adjective is here in the verse. I don't have the Hebrew in front of me.
I believe so. The only question, and I'm not sure about this, is I know part of Daniel was written in Aramaic originally, but certainly this would be Mashiach in the Hebrew. If you look at the Masoretic text nowadays, this will read Mashiach, definitely.
Okay. I'll go on. The word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. Yeah, this is one of the few instances where I think the Messiah is explicitly mentioned. I think, in my view, these very specific future messianic verses with prophetic emphasis are due to a people who needed help. These Jews needed help. They needed God to give them another Messiah, another anointed one to restore and better a present situation. I think that the writer of those verses there followed in that way. But
yeah. Can I say something in response to that?
Of course, yeah.
So if I understood you correctly, part of the idea was that so Daniel is kind of one of the later prophets, right? I mean, compared to, let's say, Genesis or Numbers or something. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that those people in that time, especially during the time of the Babylonian exile, they were really wanting someone to be like an anointed person to help them out. I'm broad strokes kind of trying to flesh out the idea here.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of like hearkening back to more idyllic times. I think you used that in one of your previous videos. Mm-hmm. Sort of like wanting a more idyllic situation. And so this could be like a way to discount some of the prophecies. Maybe you say like Isaiah or Daniel or something. But I do think there is one very serious problem with this sort of sweeping. If we take it too far, mm-hmm. if we use this as like a sweeping generalization, it seems to me that this ignores some very early prophecies about Messiah, including from Genesis 49, verses 10 to 13, and Numbers 24, verses 15 to 19. You know, David was seen as the first real like Messiah warrior king, and that his, you know, his conquest and his victory, this would be like heyday idyllic times. And very, very many of the prophecies about the future Messiah come from the Psalms. So if we take it too far and we say, oh, this is just people, you know, wishing for the old days, we have to acknowledge the fact that some of the prophecies are very early. So I think that for the most part, we agree about the meaning of Messiah. You know, and you quoted, you had a quote about this as well. You said that Messiahs are set apart to accomplish God's objectives, whether inanimate, alive, unknown, divine, Jewish, or Gentile. They are instruments of a God to carry out particular designs. So I thought that was a pretty good quote, and I pretty much agree with that.
Cool.
So there are many verses about this important figure. They don't all use the same terminology. A lot of times there are all sorts of different titles which are given. Like a lot of times he's just talked about as king or ruler. But there are others like the branch and the root of Jesse that are very, very specific to this person. And I think we both agree on that. People did start calling this figure the Messiah. It seems that this started happening around the 1st century. I mean, what's a couple centuries between friends? I don't know the exact timing, but sometime around then, it seems like that was the main one which was used. But even within the Gospels, we see some different terms used, like, are you the one who is to come? Well, actually, are you the one who is to come seems to me like less of a title, and it's more like someone who isn't sure which title they're supposed to be using for this important figure. You know, it's like ruler. I don't know, what should I call him? The one who is to come. So generally we agreed on that sort of thing. I think there are a few verses which specifically use this title for the person that we call the Messiah. I think that people need to understand that there's a difference between a Messiah and the Messiah. And I think that you've done a pretty good job explaining that in some of your works. Although I think you're against using the term the Messiah. But you understand what it means when we say that.
Yes, yeah. From a Christian standpoint, I understand what the Messiah is. And that's shared among Rabbinic Judaism as well. That's which I think is a theme that developed in the 1st century as well within Judaism, of the Messiah as well. So not only in Christians, but in Jews as well. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you can say more about that if you'd like. But your idea is that they both developed in a similar way.
Yeah, I think they developed about the same time. With the destruction of the temple, the theme became more prominent in Rabbinic Judaism. Or I should say, originating in the 1st century and then becoming more prominent within Rabbinic Judaism later. But the idea of the Messiah, kind of as you referred to it, and as is known in Christendom and Judaism today, I think really formed and was firmly established in that 1st century after the destruction of the temple, as the Jews were looking to Yahweh for their redemption.
Yeah, and I think that we also both agree that there was no one monolithic view of what the Messiah is. And I think especially from their perspective, I think that they had all of these texts, but was this the same person? Were these different people? I think these were all lots of questions that people had. So it's no surprise to me that in the 1st century, people weren't exactly sure how to think about a lot of this stuff. They didn't all have the same concept. I think that was one of the big things that you argued in a lot of your videos, and I agreed with that. There's, you know, even nowadays, it's no surprise to me that in the 1st century they didn't have it figured out. even nowadays, we don't have it figured out. People have all sorts of different ideas. I think that 90% of the passages that I would quote to you about Messiah, rabbinic Jews would agree with me on. The only ones that are going to dispute are ones like Isaiah 53 and other passages about the servant, where it looks like this is really about Jesus. But for the most part, there is a lot of agreement about what these passages are. So I want to say a little bit in defense of use. So one of my fears is that a lot of the disagreements can turn into an argument about words. I don't necessarily want to argue about words, whether we nowadays call him the Messiah or the branch, whatever words we use, it's the scriptures are the same, the passages are the same. So I don't necessarily want to get into an argument about words, but it is correct to point out that Messiah is not a unique title. It's a title which applied to many people, including Cyrus, who you mentioned. Mm-hmm. But it is also the case that it is one of the titles ascribed in Daniel 9, which we read, specifically says Messiah ruler.
Yep.
And it is talking about, in our interpretation, it's talking about Jesus, Yeshua. But there are other titles. We talked about some of those. There are a lot, actually. I have a whole list here of titles. But some of the big ones are the branch, the root of Jesse, the messenger of the covenant, the Son of Man. The Son of Man is one that is in Daniel, and Jesus uses of himself the most. So this is the one that Jesus actually calls himself the most.
Yeah. I think Jesus did view himself as a Messiah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's other ones like, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And it appears that in the first century, mainly people were using the Messiah. But and this term, this phrase, this exact phrase, the Messiah, is used 52 times in the New Testament. Now, in the New Testament, it's Christos, right? It's Greek.
Yeah.
But it's the same.
Yeah, definitely. I think I agree with you. Yeah, majorly.
Yeah.
I think Paul likely had a few different ideas that he attached onto Christ. And just so the viewers know, the words Christ, if you've watched any of my videos, I kind of harp on this just to make sure it's all clear, because it can kind of get a little confusing. But Christ and Messiah are just the anglicized adaptations of the Hebrew and Greek words Messiah for the Hebrew Mashiach, and Christ for the Greek Christos. But yeah, I agree with you that Christ, it's used in the New Testament, and it means Messiah. Yep.
Yeah. So once again, I don't necessarily want to argue about words too much, but I think that given the fact that Daniel 9 does refer to this person as the Messiah, and Jesus does use this phrase himself, in reference to himself, or at the very least, what's more common is people around him talking about the Messiah. Are you the Messiah? But Jesus does say, who do they say the Son of Man is? The Messiah, this sort of thing. So I think that in light of that, especially as Christians, we are justified in using the term the Messiah, even though we understand that Jesus is not the only Messiah speaking historically. And we could just as easily, even though nowadays it is much more common for us to talk about the Messiah, we as Christians or other people could just as easily talk about the root of Jesse or the branch or the Son of Man or our Lord. All these different titles we're just as justified in using. And so the scripture is what it is. And, I think Christians should understand, and I think your channel is doing a very good job exposing to people that the way that a lot of Christians think about it, they don't have the fully fleshed out understanding of what the word means and the history. And they should be aware of that when they use those terms.
Yeah, it's always good to be educated. There's a lot of really well-educated Christians, obviously. Yeah, you mentioned the terminologies, the Son of Man. That's probably one of the most difficult mysteries of the New Testament, I think. One that I don't think we've really quite worked out yet. A lot of work has been done in scholarship on that terminology.
I think that it basically is Jesus pointing back to Daniel 7, the Son of Man who comes on the clouds.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a big part of his messianic understanding, that he'll be the one who goes before the Ancient of Days. So the Ancient of Days is like God the Father. So he understands that he's the one who will go before the Ancient of Days and receive the power and authority, and that his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you there. I do think that it's likely that Jesus saw himself in a very special role like that in the apocalypse, which he thought was coming shortly.
Oh, that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, we could talk about all these adjacent topics for a long time.
I have strong opinions on that as well. But I'm a preterist for your information. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it's a whole other thing.
Yeah, definitely. And we can talk more in the future about like different stuff too. If you know.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah. You seem like a smart guy for sure.
Thank you. Likewise. And let me say, I was really impressed with your channel. I thought that you did a very good amount of research. Thanks. And the research I agreed with. I think as far as the data, we agree 99%. I thought your research was very good, that you cited everything. You did it in a very professional way. Thanks. And your videos are clearly well thought out. It's not just like, someone sitting in front of a camera, you've put in the legwork. So it's anyway, I thought it was very good. And I thought the way you treat your guests is generally very good. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely come off, I think, maybe a little too harsh with the Pope costume and in my videos where I'm just by myself sometimes. But yeah, we have to treat people well. So I try to do that. Just briefly about Jesus's role and how he understood his own role. I think that Christianity firmly derives from the Roman imposition. Were it not for the Roman imposition, maybe we wouldn't have Christianity today, in my opinion. And it's definitely a view that is on opposite sides of the world where Christians are coming from. But it seems that the Jews were very aggravated and that the Romans were demeaning their customs. They were putting eagles in the temple. They were being very derogatory toward Jewish rites and customs. And that from that backdrop sprung forth the Messiahs, the popularly anointed kings, as well as Jesus. And Jesus was unique, specifically in thinking that God would redeem the Jews by destroying their enemies, the Romans, and reestablishing the Davidic throne. And he did see himself serving a very special role in that way, I think. But yeah, I think we understand that we could talk more about if Jesus thought he was God, if he said things that implied that he was God, and that would take probably another hour to flesh that out too. We can probably talk more about that another time.
Yeah. So one thing that you said, I don't necessarily disagree with what you were saying about the Romans being a very big part of, let's say, Messianic culture or that sort of thing. I will say that from looking at the Bible, it appears to me that the coming of the Romans was foretold in Daniel 7. where the Roman Empire is the fourth beast, the beast which is more terrifying than all others and tramples down the whole world. And it is within this context of the fourth beast which the Messiah appears. And so, from my perspective, of course, this was prophetic. But I think even from a secular perspective, you would have to say that the people in the first century certainly would have been reading Daniel in that way. They would have been seeing Rome as this terrible fourth beast, and knowing that Messiah was going to come during that time, and that his kingdom, the kingdom which Jesus spoke so much about, would be established within the first century. So, yeah, I think that is the cultural context in which all this happened.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, it was really a pleasure talking with you, Luke, right?
Yeah. Likewise.
Yeah. And I hope to talk more in the future. I think you have a lot to offer people just in your knowledge of Christianity and Judaism. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think we had a very productive discussion.
Definitely. All right. Take it easy.
Okay.